I once served as a hospital chaplain for a semester, and as United Methodist clergy, that's what you had to do. You had to have a basic unit of clinical pastoral education if you were to be ordained. And it's been a long time since that experience, but there are a few situations that I recall because of the lessons I took with me. On one particular day, I was doing my rounds when I could hear from the far end this patient crying out, and I could hear that in her cries, there was certainly a level of discomfort. But those weren't the only kind of cries I was hearing. I could also hear in her cries of irritation, cries of disgust. And if crying out could be translated into words, she was letting her doctors and nurses have it. In some ways, I get it. When we're experiencing pain and experiencing a level of discomfort, it can impact the way we treat others and our overall disposition. And as I was making my way down the hall and getting ready to go in to visit this patient, I had a few nurses looking at me with great concern. And their looks were saying to me, "Enter at your own risk. Good luck. You're going to need it. Are you sure she would never know? Just, you can walk on by." They were offering exceptional care, but I could tell from those nurses, they were over it. So I walked in, and we had a conversation. Now, sure, she was uncomfortable, and yes, she was irritated, and she was letting everyone with the sound of her voice know it, even God. In my time with her, it didn't take me long to learn that she was having a rather difficult time accepting the fact that she was human. A human being just like every other person in the hospital, just like all the doctors and nurses and technicians who were there to take care of her. She was dealing with limitations and facing difficulties that come when something within the body has broken down and is not working properly. And she was facing something that money couldn't buy and money couldn't fix. She was separated from all the things in life that had provided comfort for her for the years. And we call them creature comforts. And I learned about all these things that she missed because she told me about all the things that she missed. She told me that she was a person of means. And not just any means, but great means. Her family was a prominent family in that community. Her family had been incredibly generous donors to the university and to the very hospital that she was in. And so she was demanding preferential treatment, wanting the nurses to do what they simply could not do, and that was make all the uncomfortableness go away. Make her bed just like the one that she had at home, to make her pillows softer and the food taste less like cardboard and more gourmet. She did not want to be in that bed. And it wasn't that she didn't want to just be in that bed. She was above. She was above having to wear that ever so beautiful thin gown with a gaping hole in the back that closes not so securely, with a little string. Such attire is standard. It's standard for all patients, no exceptions. It doesn't matter the size of the house from which you came or if you had no address to speak of. You get the same kind of gown. The number of degrees conferred matters very little when you are sick in need. No one cares what side of town you live in or how much you have in your 401k or if you don't have enough credit to which to have a credit card. Whether you are a born here or come here, they don't care. You get the gown. Doesn't matter if you vote red or blue or some shade of purple or even green. No matter if you're a Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, or no religion at all, guess what? You're going to get the thin gown. The same thin gown, the same blanket, and the same kind of anti-slippity-slip socks. You know what I'm talking about. Now, if the reason you were in the hospital doesn't make you uncomfortable enough, lying there, and all the things in life that have brought you comfort, that have brought you a level of distinction and privilege and status, if while you're there has been stripped away. And that can be tough to handle, tough to take. And so there you are, in your little thin blue gown, Carolina blue of all colors, no less. And you're invited to experience a heavy dose of perspective. And that can be really humbling. Upon further reflection, it can actually be extremely freeing. Did I say that right? It can be extremely freeing, this right sizing, this right seeing. Seeing ourselves not as we want to be seen with all of our distinctions, but be seen in the way that God sees not just us, but all others for who we are. As God's own children, made in the image of God. But as soon as we can, we reclaim the labels with the clothes. We reclaim the labels of place and belonging. And we reclaim that which distinguishes us. And we get back into our strategized communities and schools, and dare I even say, churches. See, we're not just separated by theological leanings and various denominations and way of church polity. We are often separated along the lines of race and clime and place. Oh, how I wish that were not so, but we cannot deny this ongoing sin in the life of many churches in America. Several years ago, I had my own experience of dealing with a health concern, and there were times when I would be adorning that thin Carolina blue gown. While what? While the house keys taken away. While the car keys taken away. The phone and the watch and the wallet and the clothes. And they're all placed in this plastic bag for safekeeping. It was my time to stare into the mirror. In that sterile environment, and yet thankful for the perspective, the reminder of the necessity to be seen, not for the things that distinguish me from others, but for the reminder of the importance of what connects me with others, all others. And that is we're all human beings in need of divine grace, in need of connection, in need of not being overlooked or looked down on by others. But being seen by others and loved by them. You know, we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait to put on that thin gown to gain that perspective. But there are times, more times than we really want to admit, we need a change of perspective. And we need to be called back to see others in the way that God sees them and to see ourselves in the way God sees us. Every time we gather at this altar table in the church, we are given that opportunity to remember that just as there's a place set for you at this table, there's a place set for others. And when we fix our gaze upon the cross, we find ourselves on some pretty level ground. A place where privilege and rank and status and riches and wealth earns no one preferential treatment. As I reflected on my experience with that indignant woman who was struggling with acceptance that she was just like everyone else, a person in need, I started to appreciate the hospital ministry all the more. See, I got to be in ministry with a wide range of people. People for whom I would not necessarily see on a Sunday morning in the churches I was worshiping in as a seminarian. A setting where there was no distinction. between poor and rich, between ethnicities and religions and cultures. In the hospital setting, it's easier to look in the eyes and see another person and not be distracted by the assumptions and the judgments that we bring when looking at another person. Those assumptions and, yes, judgments that I would bring with me. The assumptions that are based upon clues we often see in everyday situations, in our everyday environments. It may have been a somewhat artificial way of seeing people in such a sterile environment devoid of difference in character, but I learned that I wanted to see people in that way. Not in a blue gown kind of way. I don't even like Carolina blue, as I'm married into that color. But I wanted to see people in that way. In a way where we don't let partiality and judgments and assumptions and prejudice get in the way of trying to see another person in the way that God sees them. I knew from that experience in the hospital that I wanted and needed to be better at looking in the eyes of another and love them in the way that Christ is calling me to love them. And as Victor Hugo writes in Les Mis, to love another person is to see the face of God. Perhaps you saw that this past week in Norfolk. Oh, how to see the face of God in the face of the other, whomever the other is in any given time and place. As we make our way through the letter of James here in the 2nd chapter, James is dealing with distinction and preferential treatment and favoritism. And he's not mincing any words here. He's naming it. Partiality is sinful. And as we live out our faith, we're called to let go. We're called to let go of that which binds us, that which limits us, and gets in the way of keeping us from being the people that God is calling us to be. And so we're to seek to put our faith and love into everyday action. And James implores us, don't do it. Don't show favoritism. Do not be persuaded to show partiality to one group over another or to see another as less deserving to be here, when all of us are invited to the table of grace. And yet favoritism and being partial, it's so hard to elude. See, we enjoy the privileges that come with our individual pursuits of happiness in our country, and these pursuits then often bring distinctions and status and even separation. Showing favoritism is so much a part of our life and is expected. See, if this were the only sermon you'd ever heard me preach and you knew nothing else about me, you probably could guess I am a Duke fan. I, like many of you, have my favorites. Got my favorite school, favorite universities. And we don't just like our favorite genres of music, country or classical or music or whatever it might be. We have our favorite singers. We have our favorite groups. We have our favorite pro teams in many of the major sports. And even when it comes to maybe liking the same team, we might have different favorite players on that same team. And with our different likes and preferences and loyalties, we develop and enjoy rivalries. And if I were to say, on the count of 3, call out your favorite restaurant, we would hear a wide range of restaurants. And we'd also hear some we better go try. Same is said about places to shop for groceries and clothes and where your go-to places are for recreation or to unwind. We have our favorites. We also have our dislikes. And favoritism and being partial is kind of expected in our society. Now, I'm not going to say on the count of 3, tell me your favorite presidential candidate. Though there is this expectation, especially as we're moving closer to November, that we do what? That each of us has a preferred candidate. And with two major political parties, I fully expect people to have preferences, if not blind loyalties. Favoritism. It's ingrained in us. In high schools and communities alike, there are clubs based upon our likes and interests. And we then start associating with others who have what? The same interest, who are part of the same schools, who attend the same churches. And yet we come to the second chapter of James and we hear rather clearly that favoritism is frowned upon. But James isn't addressing our politics, our clubs, our sports teams, our singers, our shopping habits and dining places. He's addressing the church. He's rather clear that favoritism has no place in the church. That class distinction has no place in the church, and yet he was seeing it, or he'd heard about it, and he's addressing it. See, it seems that Christians were going out of their way to welcome and be hospitable to the wealthy who'd come to their assemblies to the neglect of the poor. And he calls them out on this typical games churches play sometimes. And the message to that early church is a message that we need so drastically to hear today, desperately to hear today. And what is that message? What did he say? You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. Church, who do we see? Who are we looking for? People who dress like us and act like us, have the same educational backgrounds like us. How often have we overlooked someone because we're seeking to be embraced and to embrace and be embraced by the familiar? How often have we internally questioned the way a person dressed or looked away from another than to actually see the other? I once heard about a couple who was getting married, and one of them had moved to the new town in which they were going to live. And after they got married, and so the husband-to-be had moved to that town, moved in the house, and the thought, I'll just start seeking out different churches. And so by himself, he would go to this one church, and while he was in that church, no one saw him. And if you can't be seen by anyone, no one's going to talk to you. So he went to that church, and that was his experience, but it did not deter him. And so he went back to that church, and guess what? No one saw him, no one talked to him. But that did not deter him. He kept going back to that church. But the very time his fiancée had come to town to worship with him, the same people who always overlooked him started to notice them. And invited them to Sunday school, invited them to go to lunch afterwards. In this case, the distinction was not between rich and poor, but single versus almost married. The church was not ready to embrace a young man who came by himself, but the moment he came with another to church, they could not get enough of them. That's not an isolated event. Such happens in any church on any given Sunday. And what does our vision say? To be disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, so that no one misses out on the grace of God. No one. So that no one misses out, so that the single person who comes by herself, the older widower, the couple with no children, so that they all do what? Don't miss out on the grace of God. So the person who's never been to church before and doesn't know the customs, the gay couple, the immigrant family, so that they don't miss out on the grace of God, we say. So that the divorcee or the person just released from prison who's looking for a fresh start don't miss out on the grace of God. So that the person who walked through our halls on Friday to get food for the week, and the person who sits in one of our classrooms on a Monday morning who's taking those initial steps to recovery from the power of alcohol, so that they don't miss out on the grace of God. That is our vision. And that is a key part of our vision statement. It is indeed so needed in the world that does what? That plays favorites, that loves distinctions, and judges unfairly, and discriminates with blind regularity. People, all people, we want to be seen. We want our stories to be heard. And every day, not just on a Sunday, we're given opportunities to see and meet people where they are. And the only distinction we are to seek is to be a church that not only has a far-reaching vision, but we are intentionally living it out as we truly try to do what? To see one another. And to welcome the other. And reach out in love. May it be so among us. Not just this day, but every day. Amen.